The road had stretched on for so long that the bride began to feel she had been born in that rattling wagon, her bones fused with the jolting wood and her soul stitched into the monotonous sound of hooves striking dry earth. And though the driver spoke little, she clung to his gruff assurances that they were headed to her new husband's ranch, a place she had never seen, and a man she had only known through letters written in a hand too neat, too formal, to betray anything of his true nature. She had studied those letters each night as though they were scripture, hoping to find a sliver of the man who would claim her. And though her heart trembled at the thought of belonging to a stranger, it trembled also with the faintest flicker of hope, for she had been no one's treasure before, only a burden passed from distant relatives to neighbors until the match had been arranged. And so she told herself again and again that this was her destiny, her chance, her place, until the moment the wagon rolled to a halt and all of those fragile dreams began to splinter in the cold light of reality. The ranch that loomed before her was not the picture she had dared to imagine. No laughter spilled from its porch. No animals grazed in its fields. No smoke curled from its chimney. Only silence, thick and suffocating, hung over the land, broken only by the creak of the weathered gate that swung aimlessly in the wind. And as she stepped down from the wagon, clutching her small trunk as if it might shield her from disappointment, her eyes fell on the single figure waiting at the edge of the yard. A little girl, barefoot, her dress stained with dirt and time, her hair tangled like weeds, her cheeks hollow, yet her eyes wide and unblinking as though she had been standing there for days, watching, waiting. The bride felt her pulse quicken, for she had expected a man, a husband, a protector, someone to claim her with certainty, and yet here was only a child who stared at her as if she were both a miracle and a ghost. Before the bride could ask the driver if perhaps he had made some mistake, the girl moved, swift and certain, her small hand latching onto the fabric of the bride's skirt with a grip that belied her frailty, and in a voice low and trembling, with strange conviction, she whispered, "God finally sent you to us." The words pierced deeper than the bride wanted to admit, and though the child's eyes glistened with something like hope, there was an unsettling depth there, a weight too heavy for one so young. And before the bride could ask what she meant, the driver was already flicking the reins, muttering about the storm rolling in from the hills, his voice carrying no room for argument as the wagon jolted forward and rolled away, leaving her standing alone on cracked earth, the ranch sprawling, silent behind her and the child's hand still clutching at her dress. Panic flared sharp and sudden in her chest. She wanted to run after the wagon, to shout, to demand to be taken to the place she was meant to be, but her feet betrayed her, frozen by the little girl's grip and the eerie way the wind seemed to hush as though holding its breath for what would come next. The child tugged at her hand, small but insistent, pulling her toward the house whose shutters hung crooked and whose porch groaned with every whisper of the wind. "Come," the girl said, her voice flat yet threaded with something desperate, something that sent a shiver crawling up the bride's spine. "Papa will be so glad you came." The words, though simple, struck with an odd force, for they carried the weight of inevitability, as if this moment had been long foretold, as if the bride's arrival was not a mistake, but the fulfillment of some secret prayer. She tried to protest, to explain that she was not meant to be here, that her husband's name was not carved into the land of this place, but when she looked down at the child's face, she faltered. There was a hunger there, not for food, but for belonging, a hunger that mirrored her own so perfectly it silenced her tongue, and before she realized it, she was mounting the creaking steps of the porch, the boards groaning beneath her weight like a warning. The door swung open before she could reach for the handle, the smell of dust and stale air rushing out to meet her, and for one fleeting moment she swore she saw movement inside, a shadow slipping just out of sight, as if someone had been waiting for the sound of her steps. Inside, the house felt both abandoned and inhabited, as though time itself had stopped within its walls. Furniture stood draped in sheets, yet the hearth still bore the blackened remains of a recent fire, and though the windows were clouded with grime, the faint impression of hands pressed against the glass lingered like ghosts. The little girl guided her forward with unwavering certainty, her small voice echoing softly in the cavernous silence. "This is your home now." The words struck harder than they should have, and the bride's heart pounded against her ribs with a rhythm of protest, yet still she followed, her trunk heavy in her hand, her throat thick with unshed words. "Where is your father?" she asked at last, her voice cracking like brittle wood. The girl paused at the foot of the stairs, her gaze flickering upward toward the darkness above, and for the briefest moment, fear flashed in her eyes before she quickly masked it with a smile too forced, too fragile. "He's waiting," she said simply, before scurrying upward, leaving the bride to follow or be left alone in the suffocating silence of the lower rooms. The stairs groaned beneath her as she ascended, each step echoing like a heartbeat, louder and louder until it seemed the house itself was alive, listening, waiting. At the top, the girl darted down a narrow hall, her bare feet whispering against the wood, and stopped before a door closed tight against the rest of the world. She pressed her small hand to the wood, leaning close as though listening for something on the other side, and then turned her gaze up to the bride with a smile that made her blood run cold. "He'll see you tonight," she whispered, before pushing open another door across the hall and tugging the bride inside. It was a bedroom, sparse and cold, with a single bed neatly made, as though prepared for her long before she had even known this place existed. On the dresser lay a brush, its bristles tangled with strands of dark hair, and beside it, a small framed photograph of a woman whose face was worn by time, but whose eyes were eerily similar to the little girl's. The bride reached for it, but before her fingers could touch the frame, the girl snatched it up and tucked it away in a drawer, her voice sharp now, almost pleading. "That was Mama's. You don't need to see her. You're here now. That's all that matters." Something in the girl's tone, in the way she clutched the drawer closed with trembling fingers, filled the bride with a dread she could not name. She set her trunk down by the bed, her mind whirling, her body taut with unease, and though every instinct screamed that she did not belong here, that she should run into the night and chase the wagon until her feet bled, another part of her, smaller but insidious, whispered that perhaps this was where she was meant to be after all. That. The girl's desperate grip and haunting words were not a mistake but a sign. She lay awake that night, the silence of the house broken only by the distant creak of footsteps in the hall, too heavy to be the child's, too measured to be chance. She held her breath as they paused outside her door, lingering, waiting, before retreating again into the darkness. Her pulse thundered, her fingers clutching the quilt like a lifeline, and as her eyes fluttered closed, she realized with a shuddering certainty that she had not been delivered to the wrong ranch at all. She had been delivered exactly where someone wanted her, and now, whether by God's hand or by some darker fate, she was theirs to keep. The first night on the strange ranch passed with broken sleep, the creak of footsteps outside her door haunting the bride until dawn, and when the pale light finally filtered through the grime-streaked windows, she rose to find the house both eerily quiet and undeniably alive, as though something unseen had stirred through the halls while she slept, moving objects just slightly, whispering just beyond her hearing. She tried to dismiss it as her imagination, the strain of the long journey. But when she entered the kitchen, she found a plate already set for her, bread sliced, water poured, as though someone had anticipated her waking, and though no one else was in the room. The bread was warm, fresh, almost as if it had been placed there moments before her arrival. The little girl appeared without sound, her bare feet ghost-like against the warped wood floor, and slid into the chair across from her with a stare too intent for comfort. "Eat," she said simply, and the bride obeyed, her hunger outweighing, the unease gnawing at her gut. Between bites, she tried again to draw answers from the child. Where was her father? When would she meet him? Why had she been brought here instead of the ranch she was promised? But the girl's replies were fragmented, evasive, always shifting back to the same refrain. He's waiting. He'll come when he's ready. Until then, you're ours. The way she said ours chilled the bride more than she wanted to admit. The word heavy with ownership and strange expectation, and she found herself clutching the cup tighter, as though the act of drinking might ground her in something real. The hours of that day stretched long and hollow. The bride wandered the ranch grounds, trying to reconcile the emptiness of the fields with the faint signs of recent life, the rope swing that swayed though there was no breeze, the boot prints pressed into the dust though she had seen no man, the barn door that groaned shut behind her though she swore she had left it open. Each time she turned, she felt eyes on her, unseen yet inescapable, and when she confronted the little girl about it, the child only smiled that too-old smile and whispered, "Papa is watching. He wants to know if you'll stay." That night, she lay again in the bed that had been made for her, the brush and photograph hidden in the drawer, taunting her with secrets she was not allowed to see. And again the footsteps came, heavy and deliberate, pausing outside her door, waiting. This time, however, they did not retreat. Slowly, with the groan of ancient hinges, the door inched open, and though she sat up in bed, heart hammering, she saw nothing but darkness spill into the room. The air shifted, colder, thicker, and she knew with the certainty of a hunted animal that someone, or something, stood just beyond the threshold, unseen but present, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice cracking, but only silence answered, until the door closed again with aching slowness, leaving her trembling in the dark. By the third day, her nerves were raw, her hope of rescue dwindling. She considered leaving, striking out on foot to find the right ranch, to find the man who had written those careful letters, but whenever she approached the gate, the little girl would appear, her small hand slipping into hers with an insistence impossible to ignore. "Don't go," she would say, her voice edged with desperation. "If you go, he'll be angry. He'll think you don't want us. He'll think you don't want me." And each time, guilt and confusion tangled in the bride's chest, pulling, her back binding her to the strange house where unseen footsteps haunted the nights and invisible hands set her meals. The days bled together in a haze of unease, until one evening, as the sun bled crimson across the horizon, the little girl took her hand and led her to the parlor, where the furniture still lay draped and the air smelled of dust and ash. "Sit here," she commanded softly, guiding the bride into a chair as though arranging a doll. "He'll come tonight. He's ready now." Her small eyes gleamed with anticipation, and the bride's heart thudded like a trapped bird's, panic rising in her throat as shadows thickened in the corners of the room. The child stood by the door, her expression strangely reverent, and in the stillness the bride heard it, the sound of boots on wood, slow and heavy, descending the stairs. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of fate, nearer, nearer, until a tall shadow stretched across the floorboards, spilling into the room before the man himself emerged from the darkness. His face was hidden by shadow, but his presence was undeniable, immense, commanding, and the bride gripped the arms of the chair to stop herself from fleeing. The little girl's whisper broke the silence, trembling with both fear and joy. "Papa, she's here now. God finally sent her to us." And in that moment, the bride knew with shuddering certainty that whatever mistake had brought her here was no mistake at all. The ranch, the child, the waiting man in the shadows. This had all been arranged long before she ever set foot in the wagon, and she was no longer just a bride. She was prey, bound by a destiny written in whispers and footsteps that would not let her go. The days that followed blurred into a haze of unease, for though the bride tried to keep herself occupied, sweeping the warped floors, mending the curtains that hung like rags, scrubbing at stains that never quite disappeared, she could not ignore the creeping sense that every corner of the ranch held a memory, not her own, a shadow that clung to the walls long after the light had faded. The little girl would often sit silently, her eyes following her every move, as though waiting for her to discover something she was not yet supposed to see. And when the bride would ask about the child's mother, the air would stiffen, the child's small hands twisting in her lap before she would whisper only, "She left us, but Papa said someone else would come." That answer gnawed at the bride, kept her awake at night as the footsteps traced circles around her room, and so she began exploring the house in secret, her candle trembling in her hand as she crept through hallways lined with locked doors, listening for any sign of life beyond them. One night, while the child slept curled in a corner chair, the bride pried open a narrow cupboard near the stairs and discovered a bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon, their edges brittle with H. Her own name leapt from the first page she unfolded, written in a script that matched the letters she had received before her marriage, but the words inside were wrong, darker, filled with promises she did not remember being made, as though someone had been rewriting her life before she even arrived. She stuffed them back into the bundle, heart hammering, but in her haste she knocked a tin from the shelf, and as it clattered to the floor, she saw what spilled out. Small locks of hair, tied, with ribbons, each one labeled with a different name. Her breath froze. There were 7 bundles in total, each belonging to someone who had once been here, someone who had never left. The next morning, she tried to confront the little girl, her voice trembling as she asked what had happened to the others, but the child only smiled, tilting her head in that unnervingly adult way, and whispered, "They weren't chosen, but maybe you are." That night, unable to endure the silence, the bride crept to the locked parlor where she had first seen the shadow of the man, and this time she pushed the door open, bracing herself against the stench of dust and decay. Moonlight poured through, the cracked glass illuminating the shapes under the draped sheets, and with a trembling hand she pulled one back, revealing not furniture, but a chair carved with deep gouges, the armrests worn smooth as though by desperate hands clutching too tightly. The sheet slipped from her grasp, pooling to the floor, and she stumbled back into another figure, another draped shape, which collapsed beneath her touch to reveal not a chair, but a cradle, its wood splintered and stained. Panic clawed at her throat. She turned to flee, but a voice, low and rasping, filled the darkness. "You shouldn't be in here, sweetheart." Her candle sputtered out, plunging her into blackness, and she felt the weight of a presence behind her, massive and unyielding, though when she spun around, the room was empty save for the echo of footsteps retreating down the hall. She ran back to her chamber, bolting the door, pressing her back against it as though the wood could shield her from what hunted these halls. But her shaking hands could not keep her from opening the drawer again, staring at the photograph she had found days before. The woman in it bore her own features almost exactly, the same curve of cheek, the same dark eyes, the same fragile smile. Yet the photo was old, yellowed at the edges, decades older than she could be. Beneath it, in the same drawer, she now noticed scratches etched into the wood, words carved in a frantic, jagged hand. "Don't stay! Don't believe him!" Her mind reeled. The hair, the letters, the photograph, the endless watching. It was all part of something far more sinister than she had allowed herself to admit. She was not the first bride to arrive at this ranch, and she would not be the last. She understood then why the little girl had clung to her, whispering about God's gift. This was no accident, no wrong delivery. This was a cycle, an inheritance of terror, and she had been pulled into it as surely as those before her. The next day, when the child pressed a flower into her palm and said softly, "Papa will come for you soon," the bride could barely force a smile. Her every breath tasted of dread. She knew now that the ranch was a trap, and she was caught in its teeth. Somewhere in these walls lay the truth. But to find it, she would have to risk everything. For the shadow in the parlor was growing bolder, the footsteps heavier, and the whispers at night were no longer confined to her door. They breathed against her ear, calling her name, promising she would soon belong to them, body and soul. The storm that night tore across the ranch with a ferocity that seemed almost unnatural, rain lashing the windows and wind shrieking through the broken shutters, as though the world itself were warning her of the danger to come. And the bride, heart hammering like a drum of impending doom, gripped the edges of the parlor chair with trembling hands. The little girl's small fingers intertwined with hers, cold yet steady, anchoring her in a moment that balanced precariously between terror and desperation. She could feel it in the tension hanging in the heavy, suffocating air. The father would come, and there would be no hiding, no escape. Only the inevitable reckoning for all the years of secrets, the letters, the hair, and the carved warnings that had whispered of her fate from the moment she set foot on the ranch. And yet within the tight coils of fear, a spark of resolve flared, small but undeniable, because she knew that to survive, to save herself and the child, she would have to confront him directly, meet the dark presence that had haunted every creak of the floorboards, every shadow, every breath of the wind that snuck through the walls. Hours seemed to stretch infinitely, the storm outside a relentless drumbeat that echoed the wild thrum of her pulse, until finally, the door at the far end of the hall moved slowly, hinges groaning in protest, and a tall, commanding silhouette emerged from the darkness, the father's eyes gleaming with fury, obsession, and the kind of possessive hunger that made the walls themselves seem to lean in, suffocating her in the weight of his presence, while the little girl, clutching her tightly, whispered almost reverently, "Papa, she's here now. God finally sent her to us." The words sent shivers down her spine, but the bride, trembling yet defiant, rose to her feet, standing as straight as fear and courage could allow, her voice quivering but growing stronger with every syllable as she spoke the truth she had rehearsed in secret. "I am not here to replace anyone. I will not belong to your fear, and I will not stay for what you want me to be." For a fleeting moment, the father froze, surprise flashing across his face, the storm outside seeming to pause as if even nature held its breath. But his rage quickly returned, a tidal wave of menace that pushed her back to the brink, forcing her to react with the only weapon she had, sheer instinct and the desperate will to survive. She snatched the candle from the nearby table, hurling it toward the far wall where the shadows clung thickly, and the flame erupted, sending sparks flying, wood cracking, the room suddenly alive with light, heat, and the chaos of impending confrontation. She bolted, dragging the little girl with her, both soaked from the rain that had already begun to seep through the cracks in the roof. Hearts racing, lungs burning, yet fueled by the knowledge that this was the only way to break free from the tyranny that had haunted this house for generations. Behind them, the father's roar of rage mingled with the howl of the storm, footsteps pounding across the floor as if the house itself were propelling him forward. But the bride did not falter. Each step she took was measured, desperate, determined, and as lightning illuminated the twisted path ahead, revealing fallen branches, slick mud, and jagged rocks, she pressed on, never daring to look back, for she knew that even a glance might cost her life. Somehow, by pure instinct, the pair reached the old wagon trail, slipping through the torrent of rain, the little girl clinging to her like a lifeline, and though thunder rolled like the voice of some ancient god, calling them to judgment, they pressed forward into the darkness, finally leaving the house and the nightmare it contained behind. And in that drenched, terrifying flight, the bride realized something vital, that her courage, her will to protect the innocent child, And her refusal to submit had broken the cycle that had entrapped so many before her. The storm raged on, unrelenting, yet within it she felt a strange sense of liberation, a fragile, terrifying, exhilarating freedom that whispered she had survived, that she had changed the destiny the ranch had imposed, and that for the first time, both she and the little girl might truly live unclaimed, unshackled, and unafraid.